Hello, everybody. I've been told that this film that I'm making is to be archival to, and many veterans are doing this for the Longmeadow television station so that future generations can see and hear our own thoughts. I'm doing this through memory's haze. But before I get into this fairly disjointed story of my existence, of my life, I'd like to say that it's April the 25th, 1903. I'm sorry, 2003. And the last few months have disturbed me very much relative to the actions that the United States has taken. I'm a firm believer that a man can be a good patriot but doesn't have to agree with the actions of his government. Perhaps my grandchildren or others' grandchildren or even great-grandchildren might see this feeble attempt on an interpretation of history. And I firmly hope, fervently hope, that they will understand what democracy is, what freedom is, and how precious it is, and what dissent means. And I just want them to know that it is probably more patriotic to question your government than to go along with its activities. With that, I'd like to get into my story. I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. As an infant, my folks, my mother and father, moved to Holyoke, Massachusetts. My father was an immigrant tailor, and I don't know what caused him to leave New Haven, where he originally settled after coming to this country at the age of almost 17. But at any rate, he had a few dollars, I guess, and he went into the railroad station and said, "Give me a ticket," and the ticket seller gave him a ticket, and he got off in Springfield, Massachusetts. I was born in 1921 and raised until I was 14 years old in the city of Holyoke. I went to school in Holyoke until I got out of junior high school, and my mother felt that I wasn't progressing, and I probably wasn't, as rapidly as possible, and I applied to Williston, or she had me apply to Williston Academy, where I graduated in 1940. I went to, I always had an interest in aviation, but never even got near airplanes until one day, as a youngster, at about the age of 12, saved up $2 and rode my bicycle from Holyoke to Barnes Westfield Airport, and took a ride with a man who became a very dear friend of mine, Harry Herman, for $2. And I was hooked on aviation from that point. I went to college, and in the late 30s and early 40s, the United States government started a program called the Civilian Pilot Training Program. This program enabled any person going to college to acquire aviation skills, to be trained as a pilot, and the government would fit the bill. Of course, the government didn't tell us at that time that World War II was in the offing. The reason I think that they developed this program was that the Geneva Convention after World War I prohibited Germany from training pilots in powered aircraft. They could, however, train them in gliders, so they knew how to manipulate a wing, a flying machine. I received my pilot's license, and I'll have to skip to December the 7th, when the Pearl Harbor was bombed, I came home on my Christmas vacation, went immediately to Westover Air Force Base, and enlisted in the Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force at that time. The Air Force was created in 1947. I was sworn in and sent to the Gulf Coast training area. I went to Kelly Field in San Antonio, Texas. At Kelly Field, we were all examined, tested, and it was in an attempt to determine what we would be capable of doing. We could become pilots, we could become navigators, or we could become bombardiers. I wanted very desperately to be a fighter pilot. Fortunately, I seem to have the visual skills to pursue that. The fact that I had received my license before ever going into the Army Air Corps was really detrimental. You had to forget what you learned about flying an airplane so that they could retrain you as an Army Air Corps pilot. We went to pre-flight school for about 6 weeks, where we were taught meteorology, aircraft identification, using Warsaw tests to be able to spot in an instant the outline of an airplane and know whether it was friendly or foe. After that, after getting through that pre-flight school, I was sent with a group of other men to primary flight school. It was a civilian base in Fort Worth, Texas. It had one military man, a major, who was in command of the base, in charge of the base, but all other people on the base were civilians, civilian pilots. 6 of us were assigned alphabetically to each one of when we got there, it happened to be in one evening, to each one of the pilots that were standing around this mess hall, this dining room. There was a man that looked to me like he was short and nondescript, and his name was Friedman. And they assigned me and a man named Bergman and 4 other young boys to this particular instructor. When he saw me and knew that my name was Berman, I sort of saw a twinkle in his eye. At any rate, primary flying school was accomplished, and we flew an airplane, a low-wing, open cockpit, tandem rule, the instructor in front and the student in front and the instructor in the back. And it had a Ranger inline engine, a 190 horsepower engine, which was a substantial engine, but it went about 120 miles an hour. And of all the people that were at this field in Fort Worth, I was the first to solo that airplane because, of course, I was a pilot by then. So within a few hours, I soloed the airplane, and then had a check ride with the major. And the check ride went something like this, for any of you that are interested in this kind of instruction that we used many years ago. He met with me. We stood near the airplane, and he said, I want you to take off, go to 5,000 feet, make clearing turns to see that nobody was there, and give me a series of, and he named the series of acrobatic maneuvers that he wanted me to do, and then return to the field. He got in the airplane, as did I, and he could communicate with me, not through radio. We didn't have a radio in the airplane. We had Gosports, which were tubes and with a funnel-like device that he could speak into, and it was plugged into my headset, my helmet. And but he didn't say a word, and I went up, and as I cleared the area by tipping the airplane to the left and to the right to make sure that I wouldn't run into anybody when I did these maneuvers, I saw a shadow on the ground. And it was another airplane. The sun was over here and the shadow was here. So I could not see the airplane, but I saw the airplane shadow. So I indicated to the major who was in the back, and I said, and I pointed down. He then observed the shadow. I turned to the right and did my maneuvers. I did them all as he had instructed me to, and went back, and he told Mr. Friedman that it was the best check ride he had ever given, which was very flattering to me and very flattering to Mr. Friedman. From that point, we went to basic, which we were assigned to an airplane called a BT-13, which had a radial engine, a large engine, and was a considerably heavier aircraft. In that aircraft, we were taught to fly formation, fly at night, do that kind of thing. After 60 hours in that airplane, we split off. The people that were going to be flying bombers were sent to twin engine school, and the fighter pilots, the people they felt had the acuity to fly fighters, were sent to a single engine program. I was sent to, by the way, of the 6 men that were with Mr. Friedman, 4 of them flunked out. Only 2 completed the course. The military, through these civilian instructors, had no patience at that time because the war was very, very new. And they didn't have time to coddle anybody. If you had the skill to become a pilot very rapidly, you went through. If you didn't, you would get washed out and pursue something else within the Army because you were still part of the Army Air Force. Went to single engine school where you learned aerial combat and a lot of gunnery, shooting at targets, long sleeves, towed by other aircraft, and ground targets, which were tent-like devices that were on the ground, and you would strafe and fire your guns at that. I graduated from flight school and was awarded the wings of a second lieutenant. And then a group of us, about 8 men, were assigned to a base in Florida, Orlando, Florida, in fact. It was to the School of Applied Tactics. When we reported, we took a train from Victoria Field in Texas, where we had our advanced training and graduated, to Orlando. And there we joined this School of Applied Tactics, which was a school where various pilots from various parts of the nation were sent to learn combat techniques. And it was really war games. We were stationed in Cross City, Florida, which was a swamp, alligator-infested area with a very remarkable little town with just a mud road running through it. And we would sit around, a gong would go off, we'd jump in our airplanes and go attack another field in another part of Florida, or we would intercept somebody who was being trained to attack another field, and we were sent up to intercept them. And we did this for a period of months, and then we were all activated at the same time. After flying together for a period of almost 8 months, we were activated as a squadron and went to New York. I think it was Shanks, Camp Shanks, and from there took a South African mail boat to England. It was a wonderful experience. We went in convoy. It took us 18 days to get across the Atlantic Ocean. Many of the enlisted men who were living in the bottom of the boat were deathly ill on that trip. When you put on the radio after you got closer to England, you heard broadcasts that were performed by a woman named Axis Sally in welcoming us to the European theater of operations and saying, we will meet you in the skies over Europe, and trying to intimidate us before we even got there. The boat docked in Liverpool. We took an overnight train to a town in the south of England called Lymington, a wonderful town in an area called New Forest. And it's between Southampton and Bournemouth, right off the Isle of Wight, the estuary of the Isle of Wight. You will find what used to be a horse farm and was converted into a makeshift field for us. Our aircraft arrived by boat. It was a heavy airplane. It was a P-47. It was the airplane that we were flying in the School of Applied Tactics in Florida. When we got the aircraft, the first mission that we flew was an orientation mission. 12 airplanes would, no, I'm sorry, 4, 8, 9, 8 airplanes would take off and fly across the channel and circle over France, just to give the pilots a feeling of what it was like to fly over enemy territory. On the first flight that we had over enemy territory, one of my good friends was flying the last airplane of the second flight. And I'll explain that in a minute. And we made the sweeping fighter sweep over the enemy territory, and all of a sudden we realized that this boy, this man, his name was Wilkinson, was nowhere to be seen, and he was never heard of again. They knocked him off in some way. I don't think it was ground fire. I think it was an aerial attack, but we weren't even aware that it had happened until after it had happened. We were all very young. I was 22. My squadron, let me explain that a flight is made up of 2 or more aircraft. A squadron is made up of 2 or more flights. A group is made up of 2 or more squadrons. And a wing is made up of 2 or more squadrons. My group commander was a man named Johnson, and he was 25 years old. I was at that time either 21 or 22. He was the squadron commander. The group commander was a man named Colonel Greenfield. Colonel Greenfield was 27 years old. The wing commander was General Quesada. Quesada was 29 years old. So we were all very young men. When I go through my life today, and people will say, "Oh, well, he's only a 25-year-old boy," I think back to those days many years ago, and wonder not how we did it, but it was just a different attitude towards youth and age. We flew out of Lymington for quite a few months. I'd say 6 months. And then the missions were, the P-47 was designed as a fighter bomber. It had 4 50 caliber machine guns on each wing. It was a single pilot airplane. It weighed 7 tons loaded. In fact, loaded, it weighed a little more than 7 tons. It carried bombs under its wings, either 2 500-pound bombs, or under its belly, 1 1,000-pound bomb. And it was used primarily for ground support. And that ground support only occurred after the invasion of Europe. Prior to the invasion of Europe, most of our missions were missions of opportunity, going across into France and strafing primarily trains to stop the Germans from supplying their troops in France from Germany. We also did a lot of dive bombing of bridges, trying to break the cycle, the transportation qualifications of the German army. We knew that something was happening because the area around Southampton and Bournemouth in the south of England started to fill up with a lot of boats. Now, we knew that the invasion was coming. And finally, one night, our colonel called us in and said, well, gentlemen, it's tomorrow. And he had the 12 men that were going to participate in the first flight protecting the troops on D-Day. We took off. We had a battle breakfast, which was steak and eggs, and we took off at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I led one flight, and there were 2 other flights involved, obviously, 4 planes in each flight. And we spent, you could practically walk from England to France. The water was just bumper to bumper. The traffic, there are so many boats you could have walked across. I've never seen an armada that size. I never could have imagined an armada of that size. At any rate, we flew 3 missions that day. We spent our ammunition, came back, reloaded, went back over, and we did that 3 times. There was very little opposition in the air. We tried to stop the artillery from firing on our troops that were landing on the coast. That era in my life, and I'll digress for a moment, all of the men that I was with, we all came from various parts of the country. We had various backgrounds. Theologically, in every way, we were different. I flew with a man named Hall. He came from the Badlands of Texas. He never wore shoes. He didn't know how to drive an automobile. He became one of the best pilots in our organization. But the camaraderie that we had, the feeling that we had for each other, the fact that any one of us would have given our lives for the man that was flying with him on his wing or the man whose wing we were flying. It was an experience that I never again had the privilege of happening in my life. That camaraderie meant more to me than any other relationship I've ever had. The first 3 months that we were in Europe, we lost 30% of our pilots. You would go to breakfast in the morning and you'd come back at night and 1 or 2 of the people that you had breakfast with were not there. It was a difficult time, but the resiliency of youth got us through it. After the invasion, within a few days, our engineers went into France and in a town named Carentan laid a metal grid on another horse farm and created a runway for us, and we landed in Carentan within a week after the invasion. Then our main job was to keep German aircraft away from our troops and aid our troops if they faced opposition on the ground. We did that by strafing and dive bombing. As the line moved forward, and Paris was liberated, we went to Orly Aerodrome, which was one of the airfields that was feeding Paris. It was near, not too far away, but it was a little bit out of Paris, near the Charles de Gaulle airport. And we were stationed there for about a month. In thinking about talking about those days, I thought of a story. I was asked a year ago, last November on Memorial Day, to go to the Air Museum and be a host for Veterans Day, and to show the P-47 that's on display there. I did that for a day, and when they asked me, they said, would you, for our program book, tell us if you have any memorable experience that you'd like to. And I want to tell you the story of the memorable experience that I had. When stationed at Orly, I led a troop of 12 P-47s, and my assignment was to contact an Air Corps pilot that was on the ground in a tank column outside of Luxembourg. I called, I got my 12 airplanes over there, and I called the pilot on the ground. He called me back, and he indicated that there were German tanks that had stopped this line of American tanks. And he gave me the coordinates of where these German tanks were, and there were indeed 11 German tanks in a field that was right bordering the highway, the roadway that they were using to try to get to Luxembourg. I put my squadron in trail, which meant that we would each follow, the second man would follow me, and the third man follow him, and so on. So we would go over this field one at a time, and we pressed our attack very, very low, and dived and strafed the 11 German Tiger tanks that were in that field. We also released our belly tanks so that the field was saturated with aircraft fuel, and the incendiary bullets that came out of our guns lit the field on fire, and it was just like a big explosion. We disabled those 11 tanks, and as we were pulling up, a voice from the ground called me by the name, the code name that I had, which was Wildcat Leader, and said, "Wildcat Leader, this is a 4-starred man. Good job." Well, I felt very good about that, and I took the squadron around the back of Luxembourg, and we used our remaining ammunition to strafe the German columns that were leaving Luxembourg. By the time we got back to our base at Orly in Paris, there were newsmen waiting for us, and we received the word that Luxembourg had been liberated. The fact that General George Patton called me that day meant more to me than the Distinguished Flying Cross I was awarded for that mission. I continued in Europe in my squadron as a flight leader, and was rotated back to the United States with another member of my squadron. I really didn't want to go. The colonel came into our tent one night and said to the other man, whose name was Gallagher, said, "Gallagher, you're going home tomorrow," and we all, of course, would drink to that. And then the colonel called me outside and he said, "You're going with him." I said, "No, Colonel, I don't want to go." And but he insisted that I do go. He said, "You can come back." Well, I did come back and became a staff officer at the largest base in the largest gunnery base in the United States, and that was in Yuma, Arizona. The war ended, and I went back to college, got a degree in economics, and came back, became a retailer in this area. America was not prepared for World War II. The war that we just went through, that I started this meandering talking about, was a 3-week war. World War II was well, for some people, it was a 7-year war. The equipment that we were fighting against, we had Sherman tanks, which were adequate. The Germans had Tigers, which were wonderful. We had a 90-millimeter gun, which could fire horizontally. The Germans had an 88-millimeter gun on the Tiger tank that could be elevated and used as an anti-aircraft gun. The German aircraft, we were told that we had the best aircraft in the world. Well, we were told that until the first time you saw a German Focke-Wulf 190, for instance, he would be going up to the sky and climbing much more rapidly than our P-47. Of course, the P-47 could dive faster because it was big and chunky. So when I hear of war escapades like in Afghanistan, where we used B-52s to bomb from 35,000 feet, men on horseback, World War II was different. Thank God I shouldn't use that expression necessarily, but we only in this past fracas, 130 men. World War II claimed 300,000 Americans. 30,000 combat pilots were killed in World War II. Nothing I've ever done in my life has been more significant to me, more memorable than those few years that I participated in that conflagration. Thank you very much for listening to me.